The fluorescent lights buzzed like the generators she remembered. Katie Morrison tied her brown hair back, revealing a thin scar along her jawline that she told curious residents came from a car accident. 3 years at Cedar Creek Medical. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of being just another nurse in the pediatric ICU, precision fours and vital assessments delivered with the kind of muscle memory that didn't belong in this uniform. She clocked in at 6:38 a.m. The parking lot had been empty except for the night shift cars and the rain hammering down like applause on asphalt. Colorado Springs in November. High elevation, thin air, the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions about your past. That's why she picked it. That's why she stayed. The antiseptic smell hit her first as she passed through the unit doors. Bleach and something chemical underneath, masking older smells she carried in her bones. Dust. Blood. Diesel fuel from a Blackhawk's rotor wash at altitude. She pushed it down the way she'd pushed down everything else, clean, methodical, like clearing a field after a firefight. Her locker was in the back corner of the break room. Brown metal, dented. Inside, scrubs, a spare pair of shoes, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle. And in the back corner, folded into a precise triangle, a flag taken from a teammate who died covering her extraction. She touched it for exactly 3 seconds. A ritual. A tether. Then she closed the door before anyone saw. Jennifer from night shift was still on the unit, charting at the station. She looked up when Katie approached. Hey, quiet morning so far. Bed 3 stabilized. The septic baby is responding to antibiotics. Bed 7 needs another blood draw around 8. Copy that, Katie said. The word tasted wrong in her mouth, too military, too automatic. She adjusted. Thanks, Jennifer. I've got it. Katie moved through morning prep with the kind of efficiency that made the residents nervous without knowing why. She didn't hurry. She didn't rush. Her hands moved like they knew exactly what they were doing because they did. 14-gauge peripheral line started at first stick. Vital signs assessed with a single glance: oxygen saturation, heart rate, respiratory pattern, skin temperature, capillary refill. Her fingers moved down a patient's arm and found the vein the way surgeons found bleeders in the dark. The pediatric patients didn't cry. They never did, not with Katie. Something in her voice made pain seem manageable. She was checking the septic infant's foresight when Dr. Pierce started morning rounds. She heard him before she saw him, his voice always preceded him like a pressure wave. Loud enough to be heard across the unit. Confident in the way men with expensive educations and inherited money always were. He had a resident trailing behind him, a young doctor named Marcus who took notes on everything Pierce said like gospel was being written in real time. Blood cultures at 18 hours negative, temperature spike was likely post-transfusion reaction, Pierce was saying, moving from bed to bed. He had a chart in one hand and a pen that looked like it cost more than Katie's monthly rent. Continue the third-generation cephalosporin, drop the vancomycin, and get another set of lactate levels at noon. Katie was still at bed 3. She didn't look up from the foresight, but she was listening the way soldiers listen, not with their ears but with something deeper. The kind of attention that picked up tells in a voice. Confidence is one thing. Certainty is another. Certainty can kill. She watched Pierce write the order. Watched his pen move across the chart. The dose was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Dangerously wrong. For a septic infant, 50 milligrams per kilogram every 8 hours. He wrote 75. She could have said nothing. Could have flagged it to the pharmacist during verification. Could have let the system catch it the way systems are designed to catch these things. Professional. Quiet. Invisible. Instead, she straightened up from the foresight. Her voice when she spoke was soft, careful to sound deferential. Dr. Pierce? The cephalosporin dosing. For a pediatric patient at 8.2 kilograms, isn't it 50 milligrams per kilogram? That would be 410 milligrams, not 600. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder in the silence that followed. Pierce's pen froze over the chart. His eyes came up. They were blue, the kind of blue that looked intelligent in photographs and cold in person. He looked at Katie like she had just crawled out from under a rock. Then he looked at Marcus. Then back at Katie. "I'm aware of pediatric dosing calculations, nurse," he said. His voice had dropped an octave. "Perhaps you should focus on what you're qualified to do." Marcus was writing something down. Not the dosage correction. Something else. Katie could see it in the way his pen moved, the annotation of a moment. "A problem noted." "Of course, doctor," Katie said. She dropped her eyes back to the foresight, her hands moving with the same precision they'd had before. The kind of precision that came from field thoracotomy with a combat knife when there was no surgical team and the patient was bleeding out on a stretcher. The kind of hands that had held a man's heart in their palms. She made those hands look like they belonged to someone who started pediatric fours for minimum wage. But Pierce didn't move on. He stood there for 3 more seconds, his presence making the air pressure change. When he finally continued with rounds, the damage was already done. She could see it in the way Marcus kept glancing at her. See it in the way the calculation sat in that chart like a bomb waiting for detonation. That was Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the break room felt different when she walked in. 3 nurses were sitting near the window, talking about a shift rotation. They stopped mid-sentence. One of them gathered her things with the careful precision of someone avoiding eye contact. They left before Katie got her coffee. She didn't react. Didn't flinch. Didn't let anything cross her face. She poured the coffee, black, no sugar, the kind of coffee that tastes like discipline, and sat down at the table where they'd been sitting. The seat was still warm. A junior resident named Sarah came in about 10 minutes later. She smiled when she saw Katie, genuine, the kind of smile that suggested she hadn't gotten the message yet. Sarah was from somewhere in the Midwest, all earnest eyes and genuine questions about patient care. "Hey, Katie, I wanted to ask you about the dopamine protocol you suggested for the post-op cardiac patient. Can we run through?" The break room door opened. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Sarah. Looked at the chair next to Katie. Looked back at Sarah. Sarah's face changed. The earnest expression went blank. Professional. Distant. "Actually, I'm going to ask Dr. Martinez about that." "Thanks anyway, Katie." She left. Katie sipped her coffee. It had gone cold in her hand without her noticing. She stared at her reflection in the black window of the break room, the careful hair, the scrubs, the woman who was teaching herself to be invisible. Her jaw tightened once. Just once. The kind of tension that would mean something to anyone who'd spent time in a combat zone, who understood what restraint looked like when it wasn't fear. She drank the cold coffee anyway. Thursday was quiet. Friday was quieter. She worked her shifts with the kind of mechanical precision that made her invisible and competent in equal measure. She started fours. She ran assessments. She caught another medication error, magnesium sulfate instead of calcium gluconate for a pediatric cardiac patient, and reported it through proper channels without saying it directly to Pierce. The pharmacist caught it. The order was corrected. No one thanked her because acknowledging her would have cost them. It was Friday afternoon when the PA system crackled. Not a normal page. The kind of page that made the whole unit's attention snap like a rifle bolt. Critical transfer incoming from Landstuhl, Germany. Air Force Colonel, combat-related injuries, ETA 90 minutes. Cedar Creek Medical, pediatric ICU standby. The pause came from the unit coordinator reading it. That pause meant something. Pediatric ICU didn't usually get critical military transfers. Combat-related injuries meant trauma. Meant surgical. Meant the kind of case that made reputations. Dr. Pierce was already moving. She could hear him on the phone before the PA system even finished the announcement. His voice had changed, higher, eager, the way voices change when prestige walks through the door. Yes, I'll be ready for a colonel-level transfer. My unit is well-equipped. We handle the most complex pediatric cases in the region. I'll personally oversee the admission. Katie was still holding a patient's chart. Her hand had gone still on the paper. The words filtered through her mind like they were coming from very far away. Combat-related injuries. Kandahar, probably. Could be Syria. Could be somewhere else. Somewhere she'd been. Somewhere she'd left behind in a classified operation that killed her official identity and turned her into a ghost who worked in a hospital in Colorado Springs and touched a folded flag in the dark of a metal locker. She set the chart down, walked to the medication station and continued what she was doing. Clinical assessment. Vital sign trends. Medication verification. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke to the resident about fluid management. But her eyes had gone somewhere else entirely. The kind of somewhere that combat medics recognized. The 1,000-yard stare wasn't just poetry. It was a real thing. A physical thing. A place your eyes went when they suddenly understood that the past had stopped being past tense. 90 minutes, the page had said. She had 90 minutes to become someone else again. To bury Captain. To make sure no one, not Pierce, not the colonel, not anyone, saw the woman she used to be. She reached for her coffee cup. Found it empty. Smiled something that might have been dry humor if anyone had been watching closely enough. I need some Jell-O, she said to no one in particular. The junior resident looked confused. Katie was already moving toward the supply room anyway, where the machines hummed and the lights buzzed and the walls were thin enough to muffle anything that needed to stay hidden. The transfer arrived at 7:41 on a Tuesday morning, and Katie knew something was wrong the moment she saw the stretcher roll through the ambulance bay doors. The colonel lay unconscious, his uniform still bearing the dust of the Ramstein Air Base where the medevac birds landed. His wife Elena gripped his hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world, her knuckles white, her eyes red-rimmed from a transatlantic flight that couldn't move fast enough. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as the transport team rattled off vitals with the clipped precision of people who'd been saying the same words in the same order for 12 hours straight. Katie caught the stretcher at the unit entrance, her hands already moving to the 4 lines, her eyes scanning the transfer paperwork while her body steered the patient into Bay 3. Pneumothorax. Hemothorax. Chest tube placed. Stable for transport. The words blurred together, but her hands knew what to do. She'd read medical charts the way other people read novels, fast, efficient, absorbing everything in a single pass. The monitors came alive around the bed, beeping their steady song, and Katie positioned herself between the equipment and Elena, her voice dropping to the careful tone she used for families on the edge of breaking. Colonel's doing well for a transfer this long, Katie said, checking the chest tube output. Clear fluid, which was good. The tube wasn't draining blood. She glanced at Elena. Are you his wife? Elena nodded, unable to speak. Katie had seen it before, that particular kind of terror that came from watching someone you loved get wheeled through ICU doors. She squeezed Elena's shoulder once, a gesture that said I've got this, and turned back to the monitors. The labs came back within an hour. Katie reviewed them while the colonel slept, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator, his chest rising and falling in that artificial, mechanical way that meant the machines were doing the work his lungs couldn't. She stood at his bedside with the chart in her hands, her eyes moving from one number to the next, and that was when she saw it. The jugular vein distension. Subtle, easy to miss if you weren't trained to look for the small signs that preceded the big catastrophes. She glanced at his face, at the faint swelling around the eyes, and listened to his heart sounds with the stethoscope pressed against his chest. Muffled. Like someone was holding a pillow over the sound. Katie found Dr. Pierce in the hallway reviewing another patient's imaging. She kept her voice low, clinical, the voice of a nurse asking a question, not making a statement. Doctor, the colonel's showing early Beck's triad. jugular distension, muffled heart sounds. We should consider prepping for potential cardiac tamponade. Dr. Pierce's face flushed the color of old brick. He turned toward her slowly, deliberately, the kind of turn that meant he was about to make a point and didn't care who heard it. They were standing outside the colonel's room. A junior resident was nearby, reviewing orders. Elena would have a perfect view through the glass. Katie knew this. She'd positioned herself knowing exactly how this would land, what angle he'd use, and she held her ground anyway because the patient was the only thing that mattered. "Nurse Morrison," Pierce said, his voice climbing. "When you complete medical school, we can discuss diagnostic recommendations. Until that day arrives, I suggest you stick to your scope of practice." His scope of practice. The phrase fell like a hammer. Katie's face went flat, her eyes going to that cold, distant place that came naturally to her, the place where insults didn't land because they were being observed from a distance, as if she were watching someone else receive them. She said nothing. Turned back to the 4 line instead, adjusting the flow rate with mechanical precision while Pierce continued, his voice louder now, for the resident's benefit, for Elena's benefit, for anyone who might be listening and needed to understand exactly where the hierarchy sat today. This is exactly the problem with nurses today. You take one trauma course and suddenly you think you're surgeons. The colonel is stable. He doesn't need you playing doctor. The monitors beeped. The ventilator wheezed. Elena stared at the exchange with the confusion and fear of someone watching a social ritual she didn't understand. Katie met Pierce's stare one more time, just long enough for him to see that his words hadn't penetrated, that she was looking through him like he was made of glass, then nodded once and stepped back from the bed. Pierce dismissed her with a wave. Katie left the room with her spine straight as rebar, the kind of posture that came from years of carrying weight that didn't show. The hallway corridor stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights humming their endless song, and she walked it without looking back because looking back would give him satisfaction. At lunch, Katie sat in the break room with a container of rice and grilled chicken, her fork scraping against the plastic with a sound like fingernails on slate. Jennifer and 3 other nurses occupied the center table, their laughter dying the moment Katie pulled out a chair. They exchanged glances, the kind of quick, coordinated look that meant they'd already had this conversation without words. Jennifer mumbled something about needing to make a call. The others followed within 30 seconds, their chairs scraping backward, their exit staged like choreography. Katie sat alone in the sudden silence, eating methodically, her jaw moving with the same discipline she applied to everything else. She didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge their departure. Just continued eating as if the room hadn't just reorganized itself around her absence. By Friday, the warning was posted. Katie read it while the day shift crowded the bulletin board, their whispers creating a static of speculation and worry. The paper was official hospital letterhead, Dr. Pierce's signature slashed across the bottom with a kind of force that suggested anger. Written warning for Nurse K. Morrison. Insubordination. Overstepping scope of practice. Effective immediately, all patient care decisions must be cleared through Dr. Pierce directly. The word sat there in black and white, permanent and public, designed to do exactly what it was doing, marking her as the kind of nurse that other nurses avoided, the kind that carried contamination in her presence. She read it twice. Her face could have been carved from stone. Then she turned and found Pierce standing 3 feet away, his arms crossed, waiting for her reaction the way a predator waits for prey to show fear. The day shift went silent. Everyone knew what was coming because you could feel it in the air pressure change, that moment just before something breaks. Katie's voice emerged quiet enough that only Pierce could hear, but there was an edge to it like a blade wrapped in velvet. The difference between us, doctor, is I've actually had to make life or death calls without a lawyer present. Then she walked away, her stride even, her head forward, leaving him standing there with his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the words to respond to someone who'd already left the room. The gathered staff went back to pretending they weren't watching, but everyone had heard. Everyone knew she'd just said something that couldn't be unsaid, something that had landed like a different kind of bomb. In Bay 3, the colonel lay unconscious in his hospital bed, the morphine drip keeping him in that place between sleep and nothing. His eyes tracked movement across the room, not fully awake, not completely asleep, existing in that twilight state where consciousness was just a suggestion. When Katie passed the glass, his gaze followed her for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. His lips moved, forming a word, but no sound came out. Recognition flickered across his face like a match struck in darkness, quickly extinguished. He'd been a medic. He'd served in Kandahar. He'd replaced someone in that role, filled a vacancy left by someone else. Something in his morphine-dulled eyes suggested he was remembering more than a name or a face. Katie didn't see it. She was already gone, moving down the corridor toward the supply room where the machines hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless electric song. The supply closet door closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Katie Morrison stood motionless for 3 seconds, her hand still on the frame, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz their electric song overhead. Through the small reinforced window, she could see the corridor where Dr. Pierce was already on his phone, shoulders squared, that particular predatory posture of a man who had just activated something he'd been planning for weeks. She didn't need to hear him to know what was happening. She could read it in the set of his jaw, the way he gestured while speaking into the receiver, the casual confidence of someone who understood exactly how much institutional power he possessed. Katie had seen men like him before, though the last ones had worn different uniforms and carried different weapons. The principle was identical: leverage, networks, the slow systematic strangulation of an enemy through channels that left no fingerprints. Pierce was on the phone to Richard Westbrook within 20 minutes. The hospital board president. A golfing buddy. The kind of relationship that meant favors were currency and questions were never asked. Katie heard the details secondhand from Jennifer, who'd overheard the administrative assistant relay the call. Pierce was filing an official credential review. The colonel's emergency procedure had violated scope of practice. Unsanctioned. Dangerous. The kind of language that made hospital boards nervous, made liability insurance spike, made lawyers start drafting protective statements. That phone call was strategic stage for escalation. Not bullying. Not public humiliation. A competent institutional attack using the weapons hospitals feared most: credentialing violations, regulatory exposure, the threat that a nurse had performed a procedure she wasn't trained to perform, that Cedar Creek Medical's credentialing standards were compromised, that someone's malpractice insurance might not cover it if things had gone differently. Pierce had done his homework. He understood how hospitals operated, how fear moved through administrative channels faster than any other currency. A written complaint could be dismissed. But a formal board review? That required documentation, external investigation, the kind of machinery that once set in motion didn't stop on anyone's whim. Katie recognized the elegance of it. He wasn't trying to prove she was wrong. He didn't need to. He only needed to prove that uncertainty existed, that her credentials were questionable, that the hospital needed to protect itself by removing her from clinical duties. That afternoon, Pierce called Katie's references. All of them. The list she'd provided on her initial employment paperwork 3 years ago: former supervisors from civilian trauma centers, a medical director in Denver, a nursing educator from the Colorado Springs Community College. He called them one after another, asking specific questions about her training, her background, her military service. Each number he dialed connected to an answering service that said the extension was no longer in service. Each contact led to a dead end, a disconnected line, a forwarding number that didn't work. The references that should have verified her competence simply didn't exist anymore, or at least not in any form that Pierce could access. That wasn't an accident. Katie knew it. She'd given Pierce real numbers, real people, but they'd been carefully chosen. People who'd left their positions. Facilities that had reorganized. Supervisors who'd transferred to installations with restricted public directories. The Pentagon had taught her that part of disappearing meant ensuring that the paper trail led nowhere useful, that anyone trying to verify her background would hit dead ends, that her professional history would read like a ghost's resume. The uncertainty that created was perfect for someone like Pierce. He now had ammunition. Her references couldn't be verified. Her background contained gaps. Her credentials, while technically legitimate, seemed constructed, seemed thin, seemed built on foundations that didn't exist anymore. Doubt was his real weapon. He didn't need to prove she was lying. He only needed to demonstrate that her story was unprovable. By Monday morning, the machinery had fully engaged. Katie arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 06 for 5 hours, a habit from 16 years of military timekeeping, showing up earlier than required, and found a certified letter in her mailbox at the HR desk. The envelope was cream-colored, official, marked with the State Nursing Board insignia and addressed to Catherine Sarah Morrison, RN. Administrative leave. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. The letter cited and sanctioned surgical procedure, scope of practice violation, and credential irregularities. It was formal, legal language that read like a death sentence delivered in bureaucratic sentence fragments. Dr. Helen Garrett from the State Nursing Board would be conducting a full review. Katie was instructed not to engage in direct patient care pending resolution. She was to surrender her badge and turn over all case documentation related to the incident in question. The review process typically took 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. 60% of her rent. 0 income. And a disciplinary investigation hanging over her head like a suspended blade. Katie read it twice, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. The nurse at the HR desk, Mark Chen, the human resources director who'd processed her hiring 3 years earlier, wouldn't meet her eyes. He knew something was wrong. He'd flagged it himself during the verification process that afternoon. The security clearance marker on her initial background check. The Federal Classification Code. The routine inquiry that had gone into a database in Washington, D.C. and triggered automatic alerts in 3 separate agencies. But Katie didn't know that part yet. She only knew that Pierce had moved with precision and speed, that the institutional machinery was now turning against her, that her careful fiction of being a quiet civilian nurse who'd simply wanted to help children in the pediatric ICU had crumbled into dust the moment she'd saved a man's life instead of letting hospital protocol dictate his death. She turned the letter over, folded it carefully, and placed it in her scrub pocket without changing her expression. Her voice, when she spoke to Mark Chen, carried the same even cadence she'd maintained since the Colonel's crash. Do I have access to my locker? Yes. But not the patient areas. We'll have security walk you out. Katie nodded once. The kind of nod that acknowledged information, not acceptance. She'd been in worse positions. She'd been shot at by fighters who wanted her dead. She'd carried wounded soldiers through villages where every rooftop held a sniper. She'd made decisions in 30-second windows that determined whether people lived or died. An administrative leave letter was a scratch compared to those memories. But the difference was that in Kandahar, she'd had a team. She'd had a command structure, rules of engagement, the institutional backing of the United States Air Force behind every decision. Here, in Colorado Springs, in a hospital where she'd tried to be invisible, she had only silence. The other nurses wouldn't look at her. Jennifer shifted her weight uncomfortably when their eyes briefly connected. The residents and attending physicians moved through the hallway as if the supply closet woman had already ceased to exist. That was the real power of what Pierce had done. He hadn't just placed her on leave. He'd scattered her professionally, made her untouchable, transformed her from colleague to liability. Anyone who spoke to her, associated with her, defended her, would find themselves caught in his orbit of disfavor. He'd won before she'd even had a chance to fight. The locker was in the break room on the pediatric floor. Katie packed with mechanical efficiency, her spare stethoscope, the notebook where she'd written medication calculations and vital sign trends, the small framed photograph of the Colorado Springs Air Base at sunrise that she'd kept behind her locker door for 3 years. And the folded flag, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, kept in a zippered pocket where no one could see it. The flag was the real problem. She understood that now, sitting in her car in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot at 1847 hours on a Monday evening with the engine off and the radio silent. The flag represented everything she'd buried. A team member. A name. A death that officially hadn't happened. A mission that officially didn't exist. Someone had recognized her. The Colonel, barely conscious, his body still flooding with morphine and trauma, had somehow placed her. And that recognition had triggered inquiries into her background that were now moving through federal databases, that were about to expose the carefully constructed fiction that Captain Katie Morrison had died in a helicopter crash 7 years ago. She could run. That was always an option. Leave a car in the parking lot, take a Greyhound bus somewhere east, disappear into a different city and start the whole process over again. New name, new social security number, new identity crafted by handlers who'd done this before. But that would mean abandoning the Colonel. He was still critical, still recovering, still in the ICU where Jennifer was now his primary nurse, where Pierce would be watching him carefully, where no one understood what his body had been through or what signs to watch for. Katie started the engine and drove toward the diner on the edge of town, the one that was open all night, the one where she could sit in a corner booth and think through the sequence of failures that had brought her to this point. The rain started somewhere near Tejan Street, soft at first, then harder, until the windshield wipers couldn't keep pace with the deluge. The headlights of other cars blurred past. The city lights scattered into fractals against the wet glass. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The words came from nowhere, an old memory, an old briefing, an old voice of a commander she'd served under in 2015. And Katie wondered, sitting in that diner booth at 0300 hours with her coffee going cold in a white ceramic cup, whether she'd finally proven that the statement was true, or whether she'd just proven it was a lie people told themselves to make sense of futility. Tuesday morning started like any other shift at Cedar Creek Medical. The pediatric ICU hummed its familiar rhythm, ventilators wheezing, monitors beeping their steady arithmetic, the shuffle of feet on linoleum that never quite quieted. Katie arrived at 0600, before the sun cleared the Front Range, before the day shifted into something manageable. She pushed through the emergency entrance because the staff entrance meant walking past the bulletin board where Pierce's written warning still hung like a scarlet letter. For days on administrative leave. For days of watching the world move forward without her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Jennifer, the day shift resident, texted her at 0640, Colonel's SATS dropping. Pierce is useless. Help. 2 sentences. That's all it took to activate something Katie had spent 5 years burying. She sat in her car for exactly 90 seconds, hands on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Then she got out and walked back inside. The Colonel lay in Bay 4, his wife Elena beside him, her fingers threaded through his like they were the only things keeping him tethered to consciousness. Katie saw it immediately, the distended jugular veins, the narrowing pulse pressure, the duskiness creeping into his lips. Tamponade. Pericardial fluid compressing the heart. The same condition that had killed 3 men in Kandahar because they waited too long, because they didn't have the equipment, because nobody knew what to do in the dark with mortars walking closer. The Colonel's blood pressure was already dropping. 78/52. Falling. Pierce stood at the foot of the bed, his face the color of institutional walls. He'd ordered a cardiology consult. Jennifer had told Katie that. He'd requested a pericardiocentesis kit. It was coming. It would arrive in 6 minutes. Maybe 7. The Colonel's pressure was 70/48. Katie didn't announce herself. She moved to the crash cart like she was alone in the room, like there was no audience, no consequences, no administrative leave looming like a guillotine blade. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory that stretched back to 2019, to a forward operating base outside Sanjan Valley, to a time when her hands knew the difference between life and death the way other people knew their own names. "You're on leave," Pierce said. His voice shook. "You cannot be here." Katie pulled a scalpel from the sterile field. The sound it made sliding from the metal tray was sharp and clean. "Get out," Pierce repeated, louder now. "That's a direct order." Elena grabbed the Colonel's hand tighter. "Please. Please help him." Katie tore open the Colonel's gown. Her fingers found the landmarks, the xiphoid process, the angle of Louis, the spaces between ribs that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She palpated once, twice, confirming what her eyes already told her. The colonel's pressure dropped to 65/42. His oxygen sat was 84 and falling. She made the incision. Pierce lunged forward. "What are you doing? That's not protocol. Call security. Someone call." The scalpel cut through dermis, subcutaneous tissue, fascia. Katie's hand was steady as surgical steel. She'd done this in darkness. She'd done this in a convoy truck that smelled like diesel exhaust and fear. She'd done this with a combat knife because a scalpel wasn't available and a patient was dying anyway. The pericardial sac was distended, tight as a drum. Katie's fingers entered the subxiphoid space, and suddenly she could feel it, the fluid compressing the heart, the organ beneath struggling like something trapped. She aspirated 320 milliliters of sanguineous fluid. Blood. Dark and thick and warm against her hands. The colonel's blood pressure rose immediately. 82, 88. His oxygen sac climbed. 87, 91. 94. Katie kept her voice low and level, the way she'd learned in the field, the way that kept men conscious and focused when their nervous systems were screaming surrender. "Stay with me, Colonel. You've been hit worse. Remember the Jolin district. You survived worse than this." The colonel's eyes opened. Recognition flickered across his face like a candle in wind. His lips moved. The words came out like gravel, Reaper. Katie didn't break rhythm. She secured the dressing with methodical precision while Elena wept against her husband's shoulder. The monitor beep strengthened. The pressure climbed to 94/58. Stable. Salvageable. Alive. She stepped back and peeled off her gloves. Jennifer was already moving, placing monitors, instructing the nurse to get the post-procedure labs. The room shifted around Katie like she was watching it through glass. Pierce's voice came from somewhere distant. "You just assaulted a patient. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. I'm calling security. You'll never work in healthcare again. I'll make sure of it." Katie turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, clear, cold, empty of anything that resembled mercy. She said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. It was the silence of someone who had held a man's heart in her hands and felt it beat against her palm. The silence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Security arrived in 4 minutes. 2 officers, polite and professional, who led Katie down the hallway while Elena screamed her husband's name and the colonel whispered something that might have been gratitude or goodbye. Katie didn't resist. She walked with her hands visible, her spine straight, her face carved from granite. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in white plastic. But that wasn't the worst part. The real nightmare started before lunch. Pierce called hospital administrator Sarah Vance at 1100 hours. Within the hour, he'd contacted the board president. By 1400, he'd sent an email marked urgent to every department head recommending Katie's permanent termination, license suspension, and full cooperation with the nursing board review. He cited patient assault, performing procedures outside scope of practice, potential felony battery, and reckless endangerment. The language was precise. Weaponized. The kind of language that didn't just end careers, it burned them down to ash. By Monday morning, Katie's official notice of administrative leave had been upgraded. Barred from Cedar Creek Medical premises. Barred from contact with patients, staff, or medical records. Pending investigation and potential criminal referral. The letter arrived at her apartment via registered mail. Official. Irreversible. The kind of notice that meant someone important wanted her erased. Pierce scheduled his formal board presentation for Thursday morning. Westbrook, the hospital president, had already agreed to recommend permanent termination and full credential revocation. Pierce emailed the agenda to all 3 executive vice presidents, credentialing review for Katie Morrison, RN. Liability containment. Scope of practice violation. Recommended action, Immediate termination with prejudice and full report to State Nursing Board. He'd forwarded a copy to Katie with a note, for your information and understanding of the consequences of insubordination. That was Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, Katie's apartment felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. She sat on her bed, fully dressed, watching the sunrise move across the floor in slow geometric shapes. She didn't cry. She'd been trained not to cry. She'd been trained to function in conditions that would break normal human beings. But she felt something in her chest that resembled the sensation of drowning, the slow suffocation of everything you'd built collapsing into void. At 0300 on Thursday, Katie sat in an all-night diner on Chelton Road, watching her coffee go cold in a ceramic cup that had probably been hot 5 times that day alone. The waitress had stopped trying to make conversation an hour ago. There was only one other customer, a trucker in a corner booth reading yesterday's newspaper like it contained secrets that might change his life. Katie stared at her reflection in the black window. The glass was cold against her forehead when she pressed it there. The woman looking back at her was thin-faced, hollow-eyed, wearing a hospital ID badge that no longer meant anything. Captain Katie Morrison had become nothing. The person who had held 12 lives in her hands across one night in Kandahar had become less than a civilian. She was a liability. A lawsuit waiting to happen. A name on a termination letter. The diner's radio played something soft and instrumental. Rain started to fall outside, hammering the parking lot like applause at a funeral. Katie wondered if the Colonel was still stable. She wondered if Jennifer had gotten in trouble for texting her. She wondered if anyone was even thinking about her now, or if she'd become the kind of person you erase from memory the moment they leave the room. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. Her phone didn't ring. It wouldn't. Everyone who mattered had already stopped calling 5 days ago. There was nobody left in the world who could save her now, and there was nothing left worth saving anyway. The trucker folded his newspaper. He left a $5 bill on the table and walked into the rain without looking back. Katie watched him go until his taillights disappeared into the darkness. Then she ordered more coffee, even though it would taste like ash and regret, and she waited for Thursday to arrive and end whatever this was supposed to be. Thursday morning arrived without mercy. The hospital's routine background check, the kind that usually takes weeks, had triggered something the system wasn't supposed to find. A classified security clearance. Federal level. Attached to a pediatric nurse's name in a way that made the database flag scream silently across 3 government networks. By 8 a.m., men in suits occupied the administrator's conference room on the 4th floor. Not hospital suits. Government suits. The kind that made phones ring in Washington before the coffee finished brewing. They didn't introduce themselves with names, only credentials: Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Advisor's Office, Pentagon Legal. Katie had no idea any of this was happening. She was in the break room at 7:56 a.m., standing at the window overlooking the parking lot, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains the color of old brass. Her termination hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. Her locker was already cleaned out. She'd arranged a transfer of her nursing license to the VA hospital in Denver, assuming that was where the rest of her civilian life would happen, quiet, invisible, useful in the margins. The coffee in her cup had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't drink it anyway. At 9:15 a.m., Administrator Vance appeared in the doorway. His face had changed overnight. The careful neutrality he'd maintained through Pierce's vendetta had been replaced by something Katie had never seen before: confusion mixed with genuine fear. "Katie," he said. "Not Ms. Morrison. Not the formal distance of administrative protocol. I need you to come with me." She didn't ask questions. She followed him to the 4th floor. The elevator ride was 63 seconds of fluorescent hum and the soft wheeze of the air handling system. Neither of them spoke. When the doors opened, 2 men in charcoal suits were waiting with expressions like polished stone. "Captain Morrison," one of them said. "Not a question. A statement of fact. We need to have a conversation about your background check." The word captain hung in the air like a blade. The conference room was already full. Administrator Vance. Hospital security. The state nursing board investigator who had seemed so concerned about Katie's unsanctioned procedure. And then the doors opened again, and a man walked in wearing an Air Force dress uniform with 2 stars on his shoulder. A general. But that wasn't the thing that made the room's air pressure change. It was the man in the hospital bed they'd wheeled in on a gurney at the back of the conference room, awake now, lucid, his eyes tracking every movement with the precision of someone whose entire career had been built on reading rooms. Colonel James Mercer. He was sitting up, color back in his face, the morphine-dulled confusion finally cleared from his eyes. When the general asked if he knew Katie Morrison, the colonel's voice came out thin but steady. "Reaper 6, he whispered. The room went so quiet you could hear the 4-drip counting time like a metronome. Katie's spine didn't shift. Her hand stayed folded. But something in her eyes acknowledged the name the way a soldier acknowledges a password, not with relief, but with recognition of a truth finally spoken aloud after years of burial. One of the men in suits opened a leather folder. A Marine liaison, his uniform crisp as broken glass, began reading from a citation that had been classified until approximately 45 minutes ago. For conspicuous gallantry under fire during Operation Forgotten Shield, he read, his voice carrying the formal cadence of military ceremony, Captain Katie Morrison maintained combat effectiveness despite severe wounds, personally extracting 12 casualties under sustained enemy contact in the Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Her actions prevented friendly force capture and saved an entire patrol. She was awarded the Silver Star for this operation. Pierce, who had been permitted to remain in the room under the assumption that this was a routine credentials review, went absolutely white. His hands began to shake. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The doors opened again. A 2-star general, the same one who'd saluted her in the surgical theater, walked directly to Katie's locker, which had been transported to the conference room. It was still open. Inside, folded with the precision of military burial, was a flag. Not her own flag. She'd never taken her own flag. This one belonged to Sergeant David Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment, extracted at Katie's insistence even after a roadside bomb had torn through their convoy 15 miles outside Kandahar. David had died 3 minutes after she'd gotten him to the aid station, his hand gripping her wrist, his last coherent words instructions to tell his sister, Dr. Sarah Chen, that he loved her. Katie had carried that flag for 5 years in a civilian locker, unable to explain why a pediatric nurse needed a folded American flag treated like a sacred object. The general saluted. Not casually. Not socially. The kind of salute given to soldiers who've paid prices that never get itemized on hospital paperwork. Bronze Star with Valor, he said. His voice was quiet but it moved through the room like a command. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. Silver Star. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one landed like a round fired in slow motion. The room's entire gravity shifted with each citation. Katie stood absolutely still, her composure so complete that it seemed to absorb the general's words rather than react to them. Then one of the men in suits, the one with the Pentagon credentials, stepped forward. Dr. Pierce, he said, and the use of the title was deliberately formal, deliberately hollow, like saying the title of someone who'd already been erased. Captain Morrison's cover was classification level Sierra 7. Code name Mercy Actual. Defense intelligence asset operating under National Security Directive since her deployment to Kandahar. You've been attempting to terminate a federally protected asset. You've interfered with her medical practice. You've publicly humiliated her? All of this constitutes violations of the Espionage Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and federal employment law. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a solid thing, a presence with weight. Pierce's voice cracked when he finally found it. I didn't know. How was I supposed to? You weren't supposed to harass her based on professional jealousy, the general said. His tone suggested he'd heard enough excuses to last several careers. Her background was irrelevant. Her competence wasn't. You targeted her anyway. That's on you, not on a failure of your background check clearance. The state investigator was already packing her files. She wouldn't be submitting a report about Katie Morrison. She'd be filing something else entirely, a formal notification that the investigation was null and void due to national security classification. The investigator's face suggested this happened to her roughly never. By Friday morning, the hospital board had convened in emergency session. Pierce was not invited. He was the subject of discussion, not a participant. Administrator Vance presented a timeline laid out like evidence in a military tribunal: 3 months of documented harassment against a federally protected asset, systematic undermining of her credibility, interference with patient care, public humiliation in front of patients and their families, and a written warning that had violated federal employment protections. Dr. Westbrook tried to defend him with the argument that usually worked in these situations: Pierce didn't know her background. The general, still present because his authority in the room superseded the hospital's, responded with the kind of ice that comes from 3 wars and 0 patients. Ignorance of who you're attacking doesn't excuse the attack. He didn't target her because she was classified. He targeted her because she was competent and it threatened him. That's a character failure, not an intelligence failure. The board voted unanimously. Pierce's resignation was requested effective immediately. He refused. A formal termination letter was issued Monday morning. By Tuesday, a video had surfaced on local news. Someone had recorded Pierce's break room humiliation months ago, the one where he'd loudly mocked Katie's hero complex while other staff members laughed nervously, uncertainty in their eyes. It went viral within hours. Medical ethics boards across 3 states shared it as training material for what toxic leadership looked like. The comments section filled with nurses and doctors sharing their own stories of similar humiliations, similar power plays, similar silence. Wednesday morning, Dr. Sarah Chen, Pierce's mentor from medical school, a nationally respected trauma surgeon, and the sister of the ranger whose flag Katie still carried, published an open letter in the Journal of Medical Ethics. I taught Dr. Pierce to value competence over ego, evidence over hierarchy, she'd written. If this video represents his leadership, then I failed as his teacher, and I publicly disown his actions. Cedar Creek Medical must act decisively to protect the practitioners who do the hardest work. Katie Morrison is one of the finest combat trauma surgeons I've ever witnessed. She chose to continue that work in civilian medicine, saving lives in a pediatric ICU instead of a battlefield. That choice deserves honor, not harassment. The letter was published online. It was shared 14,000 times before noon. By Thursday morning, the hospital board voted to terminate Pierce for cause. His medical director title was stripped. His privileges at Cedar Creek were revoked permanently. He was escorted from the building by security while staff watched from windows and hallways. Jennifer, Katie's former colleague, stood in the pediatric ICU with tears on her face, guilt and relief mixing in equal measure. Katie didn't look at her. She was already moving forward. By Monday, the hospital made the official announcement: Captain Katie Morrison, cleared of all charges and returned to active duty status, was accepting the position of head of trauma at Cedar Creek Medical. The press release included her photograph in dress blues, her military decorations listed, her combat record summarized in language that made clear she wasn't a nurse who'd pretended to be a soldier. She was a soldier who'd chosen to continue fighting with different weapons. Pierce tried to apply for positions at other hospitals. The viral video preceded him like a contagion. Rejections arrived before his interviews were scheduled. Pierce avoided him at medical conferences. His wife, exhausted by the humiliation and his refusal to accept responsibility, filed for separation within a month. By month 2, he was working per diem shifts at urgent care clinics 70 miles away, alone, no longer trusted with patients or decision-making authority. By month 3, he was driving a medical supply van across rural Colorado, delivering equipment to clinics that couldn't afford their own logistics staff. He made decent money. He saw no one he'd ever known. He heard about Katie's appointment as head of trauma from a nurse who didn't recognize him in the waiting room. He left immediately and never returned to that clinic. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in her new office on the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, overlooking Colorado Springs and the mountains beyond. Her uniform, a hybrid now, military rank with civilian credentials, hung in the office closet for days when meetings required physical reminder of what she'd survived. The folded flag from Sergeant Chen sat on her desk, framed in glass, no longer hidden. The staff who had abandoned her in the break room now competed to work under her. She was demanding. She was also the kind of leader who taught instead of diminished, who built people up instead of tearing them down. Jennifer had become her protégé, learning combat trauma protocols for mass casualty events, learning how to function when the situation exceeded normal hospital parameters. The hospital dedicated a new training wing, the Captain Morrison Center for Emergency Medicine. The dedication ceremony happened on a Thursday afternoon, 6 months to the day from when Pierce had been escorted from the building. Colonel Mercer attended, walking with a cane now but walking, his eyes clear and focused. When the ceremonies concluded, he handed Katie a new folded flag, one prepared for honor, not for grief. "This one's for the future," he said. "Not the past." Katie took it, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like someone who'd finally been permitted to exist again. That evening, standing in her office with both flags pinned to the wall side by side, the old one and the new one, past and future framed together, Katie Morrison changed into her dress blues for dinner at the Colonel's house. Elena had extended the invitation personally. The Colonel's granddaughter wanted to meet the lady who saved Grandpa. Katie texted yes without hesitation. She caught her reflection in the window as the sun set orange over the mountains. This time, she recognized the person looking back. Captain. Soldier. Healer. Real. In a supply van 40 miles away, Pierce delivered cardboard boxes to a rural clinic and tried not to think about the viral video that had ended his career. He failed every time. At the dinner table, the Colonel raised a glass and his voice carried the kind of gratitude that doesn't require explanation. "To Captain Morrison," he said. "Proof that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Katie smiled, truly smiled for the first time in months, and raised her glass in return. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.